Germany, where he was exposed to the body of thought that has challenged traditional medicine. And really, I think that was influential in his medical interests. He's then reasonably recently moved to Australia. How long ago?
Oh, 1965.
Oh, that recent.
I came back in 2008.
Okay, great. And while since he's been back in Australia, he's worked as a GP in Newman and in Wheatbelt, and he currently has a practice in Serpentine and lives in Fremantle, so he just loves a commute. That's kind of, I think. And I think the guiding principle, as I understand it in Brian's background in medicine, is the principle of wellness, rather than the old model that says you've got an illness and a problem and we'll just fix you and off you go. So without further ado, Dr. Brian Organ.
Welcome. It's so nice to see you here.
Yes.
Well, Brett's given a short potted history. I do recall leaving my clinic in Germany in tears. I left my clinic thinking I had saved I'd saved more people as a surf lifesaver at City Beach than I had as a doctor. Because for not one single diagnosis that day could I give a cause. Look, I used to be a cardiologist, I worked in intensive care, I know a thing or two about medicine, but what is the cause of illness? And Germany, of course, is the home of naturopathy, homeopathy, a lot of scientific looking at the causes of illness and how can we use nature to return to wellness. Wellness is, of course, our natural state. And so
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. It's very faint at the back. Could you maybe hold on to that?
Oh, yeah, I can do that. Yes. Which means I can walk, which is fantastic. So, you see, the whole purpose of my life has been to find what causes people to be unwell, to lose their wellness, and how can I help them to regain it. In fact, you can find my web blog on regainingwellness.com, tells you a bit more about me. So that day was actually an epiphany for me because I realized that all of my medical education, useless. Not quite useless, but could be improved. So here we are. Another epiphany came to me in Hong Kong. I was living and working in Hong Kong, and my patient there who came to me because she had cancer, and I was told, you can treat my wife, but please don't mention the cancer. And so when she died in 2006, I wasn't at all surprised. Of terminal cancer, multi-organ system failure. When she opened her eyes again, telling the people, they were very surprised. When she opened her eyes again, saying, "It's okay," she says, because they were running around, thinking, what on earth is going on? "It's okay," she says, "the cancer has all gone." And it had. Now, this challenged me, because up until then, my knowledge of alternative medicine was basically theoretical, a good idea, a good scientific basis. This challenged me. And I had to rethink, what is wellness? What is life? In fact, who are we? I had a chat with her in 2019 in America, and she was very, very well at that time. She's lecturing around the world now, COVID willing. So here we are, a doctor who has been through a number of iterations of wellness. I've known I wanted to be a healer since I was 13 years old. And confronted with the fact that the medicine that I learned kills. Now, I have to say that medicine has saved my life a couple of times. And that's a very bold and probably false statement. But there is a fact that when doctors go on strike, the death rate falls. And it's also a fact. It's, if I tap something? There we are.
Oh, there it is. It's on here.
And it's also a fact that in America, as an example, the number 3 or number 4 cause of death is properly prescribed medications which have been properly administered. And that's 112,000 annual deaths. And I want...
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll try and behave. I'll try and not say anything incorrect. So, one of the major causes for people dying of the medicine we prescribe is in fact anti-cancer drugs and indeed opiates. Opiates which are given to people for pain. Okay, are very successful if you're having an operation, but...
Maybe the battery's going.
I should maybe shout, should I?
More batteries.
Okay, I can also shout if you like. I can speak loudly. Now, so we have a problem, if you like, with the medical society now, that we like to think we know what we're doing, but in fact, we can quibble. So in fact, we can quibble about that. There's no doubt at all that there's a better way of doing things by actually returning to our wellness. Now, can anyone tell me here why we give heroin derivatives quite happily, but we're not prepared to give a cannabis preparation? I had a patient just now, I was called today about that, living in an aged care residence. She is 83 years old and dying in pain, and she's also confused. The medication she's got, Lyrica and oxycodone, is making her brain not function well, and she's still in pain because opiates, you see, don't actually manage pain that well. So when I prescribed cannabis, the doctor who was in charge said, "Oh, we can't do that. We don't know about that." Well, we've got 4,000 years of history, of course we know about that. But for that, there was a bit of a challenge. So eventually we got to the point where I was able to prescribe cannabis. And do you know what? Her medication now, the opiates have gone down. The cannabis is working nicely. The nurses say she's so much more comfortable, so much more lucid, feeling better and happy. And the family is not going to sue the doctor anymore. Fantastic. Then I got a call saying, but the nurses are unhappy. We need to have another prescription written out for this particular dose, because otherwise they're not going to give it to her. I've given this from 0.1 to 0.8, 3 times a day as you need. And they wanted it more precisely. They were happy to load her with heroin derivatives, but they were not happy to give a very healthful healing, you could call it a sacred herb, which has been transforming her health. They saw her health was better, but they preferred to give the stuff with making her sick because they were comfortable and used to that. And that is what we have in the current medical society. Maybe in a nutshell, maybe incorrect, but that is what I am seeing on a daily basis. People going to the wall, people suffering because we're having to give them medications which are not actually in their own best interests. So medical cannabis, what is it? Well, it's a cannabis plant. Now you might ask, what's the difference between recreational cannabis and medicinal cannabis? The answer is not a great deal. It's how you use it. Cannabis, on the other hand, kills no one. Why then, I ask myself, has medicinal cannabis been banned since the 1930s? And the answer is because of xenophobic, racist political diatribes by the FBI in America, who wanted to redirect the FBI agents from fighting alcohol runners to dealing with Latinos and blacks, who were the predominant users of cannabis. They renamed it marijuana to make it sound more Latino, and then started the war. How did it continue? Nixon continued it by declaring all drugs, including as a last minute cannabis, and that way, for the Vietnam War protesters, he was able then to say, you are drug seekers, we can raid your homes, we can take the drugs off you, we can arrest you, we can put you in prison, and we'll associate all of the anti-war movement with drug takers. Very successful ploy. We are victims of that. So that when I'm speaking to, say, a 65-year-old who grew up in the 60s, and saying we should maybe give some cannabis to you, he's thinking, oh, I don't know about that. Because we've learned since the 60s that this is bad for us. It's not the substance, it's how you use it. Now, medicinal cannabis, how does it actually work? Well, it may surprise you to know that throughout our body are cannabinoid receptors, CBD1 and 2, very prevalent in the brain and the neurovascular system, and present all through the body. So when we use cannabis, we're actually engaging the receptors that we were built for. I wonder why we were built for cannabis. I wonder if it's possibly because we grew up over the eons with cannabis as part of the things that we normally take. In fact, cannabis is mentioned in the Bible as one of the ingredients for the holy anointing oil. We've known this for a long time. So how can I use that? How do I use that? Well, the government, I have to tell you, my traffic jam today on the way here was actually a metaphor for the government. Can you imagine, you're sitting here in your car behind all this line of traffic. Imagine now that the government is actually driving a car in the front, and they're driving the cannabis legislation car. And you finally make your way to that car, it's doing 70 kilometers an hour on the freeway. The warning lamps are under the flashing light, and they're muttering, they're going too fast, they're going too fast. They're checking the mirrors, and they're holding everybody up back. That's what we have just now. The legislation is quite clear, the potential is quite clear, but oh no, we need to have someone making sure that we can't take a medicinal herb, which is perfectly useful. Now, I have only about 500 patients on cannabis just now. It's an awful lot more. I'm limited. But I'll tell you what, my very first patient was an old bushman. He was breaking horses from his early days, in fights, having a great time, drinking a lot, had a great life. The horses broke him. His spine was actually quite damaged, many fractures. He was in severe pain. He also loved his weapons, and he really, really appreciated being able to shoot. In fact, he wanted to shoot himself because his pain was so intolerable that he wanted to die. He couldn't live a life, he couldn't even walk to the toilet without aid, and his life was no longer worth living. This is before cannabis became so very available. Yeah, there are ways in the country, you might know there are places where cannabis can be grown, and cannabis was grown, and we made from that some oil. And I do recall him 2 days after some of the cannabis oil was given to him, and he walked in, a new man, smiling, pain-free, wishing to live. It was one of the joyful days of my life. That wasn't a life saved from certain death. It was a man who regained his life. And ever since then, I've been the privilege of seeing patients respond to what I have prescribed in the form of cannabis. And of all the items I can prescribe in my pharmacopoeia, cannabis is probably the safest. The side effects of cannabis are negligible. Oh, unless of course I look at the learned publications which are repeating the myths and the untruths of previous ages. For example, the thought that cannabis can actually cause schizophrenia. Well, actually, the real cause for that is not yet proven, but I do know that troubled children who are seeking help from their trauma are turning towards alternatives, including marijuana. And that is often supplied by criminals, going into a criminal society. So imagine a troubled child from trauma or a very difficult family finding support from criminals supplying him with cannabis and other drugs because it makes a profit for the drug dealer. I wonder if that has any effect on their future mental health. Was it the cannabis or was it the psychosocial circumstances? Oh, we don't know. No one knows because we haven't bothered to look properly. Is it dangerous? Well, cannabis can do things you don't want. It can make you sleepy. So if you've got insomnia, I can prescribe it to help you sleep. If you are dying in anxiety with cancer, it can take away your anxiety. It might even make you a little bit happy. That's a nice side effect of cannabis. What else could it do possibly? There's actually a biphasic response. You can have anxiety of losing, and when you take more, it can cause anxiety. Cannabis isn't a benign substance. You can do difficult things with it as well. But in general, if I was to give you a bottle of the cannabis oil and say, swallow it all, what would happen to you? You'd fall asleep. Nothing. So it's a benign substance in that sense. In fact, how many people have had Panadol here? Panadol kills you far more easily than cannabis. I won't tell you how many to take, but it's actually irreversible after 48 hours. If you really want to die, that's a pretty common way of doing it. Cannabis can't do that. Now, having gone through some of the issues about cannabis and some of my rant, if you like, I see my patients being required to die in pain by a government which doesn't allow them access to this. You might say, but we have legalized cannabis. It is available for medical purposes. Well, partly. I had an 11-year-old boy, autism, and the mother asked, can we please try some CBD oil? Certainly we can. But as a simple, ignorant doctor, I wasn't allowed to prescribe that because he was under 18. He had to go to a specialist, who then said, oh no, we can't give CBD oil. I am going to give this boy risperidone and clonazepam. Now, risperidone, for those who don't know, is an atypical antipsychotic, and clonazepam is like diazepam on steroids. He was quite happy giving that, but he wasn't happy giving cannabis. Who of us was the expert? Who was the specialist? Well, the government says, of course, that doctor. And another one, 17 years old, had to go to the paediatrician as well. And I said, listen, this young man is 17 years old, he has a moustache. Okay, he's taller than me, and he's the father of a child. Are you certain you want me to send him to a paediatrician? And this is what we're dealing with. I could bore you for a whole weekend talking about cannabis. It's something, it's a passion of mine. It's something, it's not one reason why I'm actually standing for Parliament, for the upper house, to allow people to be educated in the truth about cannabis. There are so many things which can be said, and I'd rather not bore you anymore, but I would be happy to ask any questions, especially about the medicinal approach to cannabis, for example, prescribing it. You need, just some information before we go into that, you need to have a doctor who is able to prescribe cannabis. Now, not every doctor, well, every doctor could prescribe cannabis, but the pathway to doing that has been made so difficult by the government that most doctors think it's too hard. I had to get some help to do that myself from the people who provide the cannabis. Having got past that hurdle, you then have to apply to the government with a 5-page questionnaire for every single patient, and then you send it to the government and they will approve or not approve according to their taste. After you've done a certain number of those, you can apply to be an authorised prescriber. Authorised prescriber. So technically now I can prescribe it to anyone who fits the criteria. It still has to go towards the government, and they still write back and say, no, we can't have this. So ultimately the government is saying they have more of a control than I do, although when it comes to clinical concerns, they know far less than I do. This is the reality. So people are unable to approach every doctor, and accessing it can be quite difficult. Unless, of course, you've got the experience. For me, it takes, well, I could do that in 5 minutes, although I take a lot longer to go through the history with my patients. Now, we have another problem with medicinal cannabis, is that there's an orthodox approach to medication. You've got a headache, take a Panadol. You've got a back pain, take some Brufen. What's the cause? Oh, we don't care. Take the Brufen. Next patient, please. Could it be a cancer you've got in your abdomen we haven't noticed yet? Here, take some more stronger painkiller. Off you go. And eventually you find the cause, maybe too late, but this is what happens in orthodox medicine. Not everyone, but this is the standard. Let's get a diagnosis quickly, a script, next patient. That's how we make our income. I see some nodding heads here, we've all been there, I think. Now, if you then give that same doctor cannabis, someone comes in saying, I'm anxious, cannabis, next. I've got a headache, cannabis, next. This is also wrong. For me, it's not just about being able to prescribe cannabis and legalize cannabis, it's about changing the way we deal with wellness. And that is actually listening to our patients, what is wrong, and how can we find out what you actually need? Where is the actual problem? And cannabis is a very suitable plaster on the symptom, but it's not a cure. We could talk about cancer in a while, but that's another matter altogether. Now, having got that out of the way, I would wonder if anyone here has tried recreational cannabis. You know what? I haven't. You could have told by the dreadlocks that I'm not actually a cannabis user. In fact, I think smoking cannabis is the worst way of taking it. Plenty of other ways of doing it, but it's up to the individual. Does anyone here have any particular questions about cannabis in general, or medicinal cannabis in particular? You, sir.
THC, CBD, content, like what balance? Should we have THC with CBD?
There's about 130 chemicals in cannabis itself, terpenes. THC and CBD are both terpenes. Now you know what terpenes are because when you walk through a pine forest and you're smelling the pine smell, those are terpenes. And the terpenes have specific effects. The ones we know most about is THC and CBD. THC is thought to be the one which makes you high, and it does. CBD doesn't quite do that. It has other effects. It sedates you quite nicely, gives you a mellow feeling. The people who like cannabis to smoke it really want to get it for the THC high. And that's a perfectly interesting way of doing that. In medicinal cannabis, there are pros and cons of each. The government has allowed one CBD dominant, one THC dominant, and one where it's about equal. That's interesting because mostly for pain, a CBD dominant is going to be useful, but I would insist that all cannabis preparations need to be the whole plant. Remember there's 130 ingredients? They all seem to work together. It's a remarkable thing, is that nature is often better than what humans can make. That's a wonderful thing. But THC and CBD are the two most important as far as we can make out for their clinical effects. So for pain, I'm very often giving a CBD dominant, and it's often 20 of CBD to 1 of THC, milligrams per mil. The THC dominant is 20 of THC with 5 of CBD, and the equal is 10-10. That's the general ones. We're now able to prescribe flower as well for vaping or for smoking. And there's a number of other approaches. In fact, now, almost we're ready to actually compound cannabis. Now, you might be surprised, the government actually had already written the legislation allowing us to compound cannabis, making it to measure. Because the 20 to 5 or the 1 to 20, does that suit everyone? No, it doesn't. There could be any measure in between of what people actually need. From April, hopefully, we're still waiting for that since November, that they'll recognize their own laws. And we can actually, in my clinic, the pharmacy next door, we have the raw ingredients and we can make to measure what anyone wants. And my preferred approach is not actually the oil under the tongue, but the trochet which goes between the gums and the cheek. And you can use 30% less for the same effect.
As in a pill or a...
It looks like a small square which dissolves over an hour.
So I was reading up that there's also one called CBG, which stimulates the appetite. Is that is not available in Australia? Is that there's only THC and the CBD?
Well, as an ingredient, we haven't specified that. However, the terpenes, I've just got a message yesterday or the day before that the terpenes we had ordered and been seized by the Australian Federal Police have now been released. And among those is probably going to be that as well. We've ordered them from Israel, where they're very, very qualified preparers of the terpenes. And we could actually make to measure a cannabis preparation with varying amounts of the terpenes according to the individual need.
So when you're making a butter out of your plant, what are you getting? THC and the CBD or?
Well, it depends entirely on what you're actually cooking. You need to know the strain you're actually buying. Now, I would...
Growing or whatever,
yeah. Indeed. Now, of course, you haven't heard this from me, but when you grow your cannabis, you really ought to know what seeds you've got.
Yeah.
And with the seeds you've got a specification of typically what growth has how much of THC, how much of CBD, and possibly a few other ingredients. I would be recommending for the medicinal cannabis that the blueberry is very good. I do like things like harlequin, very useful for the medicinal cannabis.
Yeah.
Delivery of the medicinal value. If we take it orally, I believe we only get about 5% of the benefits. So which are the better ones to deliver?
Good question. There's a lot of variation in that. If you swallow THC, it's absorbed via the gut, goes to the liver, it gets metabolized, methylated, and it's not as effective. You need a lot more cannabis for the same effect. When you take it sublingually, you're going to get much better absorption. I prefer, however, the choice to have it buccally, which would give you an even better absorption over time with better availability.
Sorry, what's sublingually?
Under the tongue.
Okay.
when you apply that, you can apply that also as a cream. There's a patient we've got here with nasty, nasty neck pain, and there's all kinds of painkillers. But with, we made a cream there which had ketamine and ketorolac and some cannabis, and it worked wonderfully. With a bit of DMSO to absorb it under the skin, wonderful penetration right to where the pain was, very, very successful. There's other things you can do, the butter you mentioned, making the cookies and whatever you want to do, not that I know about that. But the absorption there is through the stomach, and you need a higher quantity for the same effect. Smoking it, of course, is a whole different prospect. You can vape it, or you can smoke it, or you can get burners here which give the vape as well. The vape, of course, you talk about the juice in the vape machines. I'm not quite sure how those are really implemented, because it depends very much on how you're using it. Smoking it certainly has a much more immediate effect for instance sedating people or getting them the high, but it's also a thing wears off quicker. Yes?
Given what you just said about the absorption and metabolism, but then you also said that it's quite benign, can that have an effect on liver function and those types of things?
The question about adverse effects on liver and other organs. The main concern we have with cannabis is how it affects other medication. Will it increase that or decrease that efficacy of other medication? And there's a list of medications which have ups and downs. Especially if you're taking warfarin, you want to be careful, because that has an immediate effect on your ability, on the clotability of your blood, or indeed the danger of bleeding out. The effect on the liver, actually no, it's very well, it's a plant. It's not a toxic plant either. There's certain plants you can have that you shouldn't have. They do kill your liver. My favourite example is a certain mushroom. It's, I don't know the English name for it, in German, Clonabetapilz, which regularly kills people in Germany because it looks pretty benign. And it just because it's a very important central necrosis, and people's livers just fail.
So what about the processing to do with thyroid function or diabetes, that kind of thing?
It's been used very effectively in all kinds of chronic diseases. So cannabis itself will be complementary, but it won't actually replace any of those therapies, and it certainly won't negatively affect the thyroid. Not least in my experience. I have a specialised clinic looking at thyroid disease as well. I haven't come across any issues with that. Although doubtless in the future, as more research happens, we're going to see more and more reports coming out. But at the moment, all I can say is I've seen none of that myself. Any questions? Sophia, hello.
There's often a link discussed between cannabis use, recreational use, and psychiatric issues.
The link between cannabis and psychiatric issues, yes, this is a major concern. I do recall in my early years working in psychiatry, a very troubled youth who had a schizophrenic psychosis attributed to his heavy cannabis use as a 14-year-old. And it was very clear then that the word was cannabis causes psychosis. I think there's research to show that those youths, those children who use cannabis early have got about a 4 to 7 times chance of having a psychotic process later. But you have to consider that those same children are the troubled children. The ones who are not troubled are not the ones who go out seeking cannabis or criminal associates. So those who are troubled, having a stressful childhood in itself is a risk factor for a psychotic process. And in fact, you could argue that the whole condition of a psychosis is psychosocial in nature and not due to cannabis. It's an association, but we can't prove actually that because you've got this, it's the cause, it's associated, but what's the causality? That is yet to be formally diagnosed. Because it's been forbidden for so long, no real research has gone into the real causality. But the same problem also occurs here with the question about going into addictive behaviours. And simply, is cannabis the gateway drug into addictive behaviours? The answer is no. Cannabis as such isn't really addictive, although you can get addictive personalities for that. But as a gateway into addiction, it's actually more likely to be alcohol that's the problem, that freely available substance over the counter. But beyond that, alcohol isn't the real problem, it's trauma. Trauma is the real entry point into addiction. Yes.
Have you seen any serotonin syndrome with people who are on antidepressants and then they're taking the CBD? Do you need to have a space between it of like 2 hours, or there's no increase in the uptake of serotonin?
There's no actual problem between taking antidepressants and cannabis. In fact, what I find is that you can take it any time. I like to see, I've got a number of patients who have been on antidepressants, and with the cannabis that they're taking, they're coming off the medication. And this is actually a goal of ours, to come off medication, stay on cannabis. There's a question at the back there, yes?
Do we know how it works in the body to fix things? Do we know how it works in the body to fix things?
That's very interesting. Now, we've talked about pain and the CBD 1 and 2 receptors. When it comes to the cellular functions, a fascinating science we could look at there. It takes about 6 weeks, but maybe up to 3 months, before we can see a cellular change. And it seems to work on cellular communication. We think cells are kind of little things on their own, but they actually communicate cell to cell. And there's actually a whole energetic movement between them. And it seems to be that there's a transformation of the cells. So particularly for cancers, it's quite a useful thing. Has to be said that some cancers often don't respond. For example, breast cancer, in my experience, we do a cell, we check the viability of the cells and the sensitivity to cannabis and other things. And for breast cancer, we're often seeing no effect. Vitamin C, yes, glutathione, yes, but cancer is not. Other cancers, colon cancer, particularly brain cancer, good things can happen there. Yes?
Is there any evidence that cannabis affects short-term memory?
Short-term memory, I forget. If you are going to be taking high doses of cannabis at a young age, I suspect we're going to find effects on the central nervous system. I personally do not recommend that youth take cannabis. We need to say under 18 is probably a bad idea. Now, let's make a differentiation here. Male brains are not as advanced as female brains. So I would be suggesting that for the male, 23, 25 is probably a good age when we get some stability in the brain. But that's me being un-PC again. But it's like alcohol as well. You don't want to give a 13-year-old a bottle of whiskey. You just don't do that. Giving them access to full-strength THC potent cannabis is not a good idea. If you were to do that, I do suspect we're going to find memory issues. And for the heavy chronic users, there is credible evidence that there is actually issues with long-term memory and possibly even dementia. But then we're talking here not about medicinal use or sensible recreational use. We're talking about the same effects if you're using excess alcohol with the Wernicke's encephalopathy, Korsakoff syndrome, and early dementia. Those are things which happen with the excess use. So I'll make a difference not between the substance, but with how it's used. You have a question there?
Is there an average monthly cost for a management using cannabis?
You're much cheaper growing it your own. The bottle itself is about $200. Some people are charging $600, but I do believe that with the competition coming on now, the price will be coming down. And I know that our compounded cannabis is going to be cheaper.
I'm wondering from what you said whether there's any way of thinking about dopamine deficiency.
Oh, yes. Yes, now dopamine deficiency. One of the things I like doing is checking the neurotransmitters. People who've got depression, they come and say, I've got a low mood, I don't like life, I want to end it all, are often given an SSRI or SNRI for serotonin to be increased as one of the neurotransmitters. And that seems to be about it. However, we can actually check for neurotransmitters, serotonin, gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, these things. Now, it's easily done, but no one does it. So I generally, for people suffering with these issues, I check that. Cannabis doesn't do, as far as I'm aware, anything to enhance the dopamine. I don't know, but there's not enough research that I know about to prove that. But I'll actually look into that, thank you.
Cannabis and glaucoma, does it lower the pressure?
No, cannabis does not help glaucoma, I'm afraid. Sadly. But you can try. Who is that thing?
Cannabis is, CBD oil is legalised now. Why can't we buy it over the counter when we used to suspect that we can? Why is the process so lengthy and so expensive to get a script?
Do you remember that story I gave about the traffic jam? And the government with the warning lights on, that's what they're doing. Also, we haven't got enough available. The government likes to have it made under certain very strict conditions. I went to a cannabis growth farm for Little Green Pharma, beautifully done, but they had to be accountable for every single leaf. For every single leaf. If there was a gram missing, then they were actually at risk of losing their accreditation. So with the CBD making that was actually, it's actually slowed down by the government red tape. But also, we don't have enough because it's suddenly become allowed. This illegal drug is now, okay, how do we make that? Who's growing it? Who's preparing it? It's a difficult thing. Having said that, pure CBD, isolate CBD, I wouldn't touch. I like the full plant, the full spectrum. The isolated CBD on its own might work, but in my experience doesn't.
My daughter's got epilepsy and it's good for epilepsy. I work at her children's and we're giving it to children there. But when I talk to her about using it, it's a bit tricky, like how you know how long to take it for before you start weaning your medication. And
That's the issue. Is it the full spectrum CBD or isolate?
it's nano.
It's probably full spectrum. Isolating CBD, as I said, makes it much more expensive, but twice as expensive. The only advantage is you never have THC, therefore you can take it on site if you're FIFO. But I don't think it works. It might work, but in my experience it's not nearly as potent.
But that is the one that they can approve for children because it doesn't have the THC in it.
Very possibly, but I wouldn't do that. I prefer the full spectrum with a touch of THC. It seems to work much better. The epileptic case I've got was a very, very difficult case, refractory to all medication, and on a mixture, the CBD on its own, with just a tickle of THC, didn't work. The 1010, that worked at a higher dose, and that controlled quite nasty 2 or 3 times a week epileptic seizures.
You've given us several examples of where cannabis works and doesn't work. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the conditions or the circumstances which would trigger you to think, that set of conditions leads me to think that cannabis might be a good idea.
I think I'm a bit biased about the conditions. Obviously, pain and epilepsy are 2 very common conditions. I recently prescribed that for another case of Parkinson's. The issue with Parkinson's is actually a part of the brain which is malfunctioning, and over 3 months we're looking to see if the cells there can change the way they function. That's one aspect, and the other one is if you can maybe stop the tremors which are there, which can be very, very painful, and just relax the person as well as calming the mind. That's very useful, so symptomatically we can control, but the interesting thing is can we reduce the actual load of Parkinson's disease? Autism is another area where we're very interested in how that works. We've also got ADHD, which is actually a useful approach. Insomnia is another one where, I don't know how many people take sleeping tablets, but they're not actually good for you, whereas cannabis as a sleeping tablet is very, very effective and very useful, and very safe indeed. What else is there now? Nausea is used, I like it in palliative care. Now, in palliative care, we're looking here for managing wellness up to the end of life, which reminds me, people ask me, it's one of my interests, when should palliative care start? And my answer is at birth. It's really about ensuring dignity and quality of life, and that should be from birth right through to death. But palliative care, in our sense of the person who is dying, it's a whole host of symptoms which need to be dealt with. Cannabis is very useful as part of that, but not the only substance. There's many things, very, very useful part of that. Other things, behavioral disorders, Tourette's syndrome, for example, is very useful. Neuralgias or whatever source, anything to do with nerves would be a good thing, and that includes some of the psychiatric issues. Depression might be useful, behavioral disorders, and that type of thing. I would have to, normally when I'm talking with a patient, I'm looking to see my general approach is, can I say that cannabis isn't necessary? Because a lot of our issues, cannabis would be helpful to assist in the general management. But those are some of your symptoms.
Do you know why? Why it helps?
Why? What helps?
Cannabis.
Tell me.
I'm asking, is there a pattern underneath all that?
Oh, a pattern underneath. How it helps. Well, cannabis actually is a fascinating drug. I've called it earlier a sacred herb. It's been used over millennia, and it's been very effective for a whole host of conditions. We haven't really isolated all of the effects. Well, in fact, we haven't even begun to assess that. What we do know is fairly recent research. The Israelis were very good at doing the initial research, and they were showing what the mechanism, for example, the receptors, the two types of receptors, that's Israeli work. Of course, we've now got America, in Europe, there's research going on as well, and gradually in Australia as well, we're getting some research into this. So we're still identifying how it actually works. I mean, apart from those two main receptors, how does it work? My particular interest is in the cell communication, because that seems to have the most potential for managing wellness for a wide variety of illnesses. I've used this for Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, with good results. Which reminds me, I didn't mention that the suppositories. So I've got a patient with cancer of the rectum, and we're putting very high potency THC suppositories rectally, directly to the cancer.
And that's giving him a lot of relief?
So far, yes. Yes.
Can you talk more about how it can help autoimmune issues?
Autoimmune. Well, this is where the broader spectrum. What is the cause of autoimmune disease? I have a particular slant on that. I think our chemical world is actually partially responsible. Autoimmune disease where the body is attacking body. And that's an immune system problem. It's an immune recognition problem. Are we good for time, by the way? It's an immune recognition system. And so I'd like to look at how can we enhance the immune recognition system itself. And that's so one thing helping that. The other side, can cannabis help with that? I do believe it can, but we haven't got nearly enough research. I'm using this, for example, in patients who've got autoimmune disease, say rheumatoid arthritis. It's not just for the pain, but how is it affecting the cells? That's probably the commonest one. My thyroid patients with Hashimoto's, also autoimmune, how's that helping there? There seems to be some subsidence of the autoimmune, but I'm not yet sure if it's actually the brain settling down and you're calmer, or if it's actually the cells settling down as well. But bearing also in mind that it's not just the first day, the first week, it's probably a 3-month time scale before we can see the cellular changes.
But then if you're saying that the cannabis thing is making a massive impact with the colon cancer, like I kind of feel like there's a lot of autoimmune diseases that occur there, like with the research with the crapshaw. I don't know if you've heard of that. Is the fecal transplants
Oh, yes.
for the VRE and CRE? So maybe the cannabis is kind of helping with all that issues as well. And if you combine the two, then maybe you've got.
Well, that's a whole different topic. The fecal transplants, the interesting thing is that the microbiome at a certain mass actually acts as an organ, not as individual bacteria. And that's really fascinating. So as an abnormal microbiome actually promotes illness, whereas a normal microbiome, you can take from a healthy non-fat person, their microbiome, transplant that into a fat person, and they lose weight. From a normal person into a depressed person, the depressed person loses their depression. That's absolutely fantastic. So the idea of actually just whacking them full of SSRIs really isn't the solution. Cannabis is another interesting aspect, but we're looking here at the multifactorial aspect for managing chronic disease and restoring wellness. The cannabis on its own isn't a panacea.
When is the government going to make doctors more educated about it? Because I saw one doctor who was really judgmental and really uneducated on it. And I've come from the Caribbean where they've been doing this for palliative care for a long time, and I was actually disgusted at how far behind Australia is.
Not just Australia, in most parts of the world. You see, people think that doctors are intelligent, and you're wrong. Doctors have good memories. You don't need a good intelligence to be a doctor. All you have to do is remember stuff. The old-fashioned days are the great doctors of Pasteur and Koch and those great GPs. They did their research, and they transformed the world. And you are allowed to think outside the box because you're in the art of medicine. You look to be listened. The number of times a patient has said to me, "You're the first doctor who has listened to me," and it breaks my heart every time. This is what we should all be doing. Listen to your patients and then form your own opinion. You need to have a free mind. What we have now is doctors who have come through with grade A's, and that's not the best doctor. You need someone who thinks for themselves and has got a heart and a vocation for wellness. Okay? Not someone who can remember things and tick boxes. And tick boxes to satisfy the lawyers and to satisfy the corporate leaders in the hospitals. We don't need that. That's what we've got. And that's what you're experiencing. Doctors who've been educated in a system which tells them not to think outside the box, because that's not what we do, it's not normal, and you'll lose your license if you do that. So educating them is an uphill battle, but we're starting that. That's why we've got someone in Parliament just now, and we'll start that and we will continue that.
There is a trial up at Subiaco at the moment with the St Francis Pharmacy, and they're compounding.
Yes, I have an issue with that because our advice has been stolen by them and they're using it, but we've caught up now. So yes, they're doing good work there and good on them, and we need more of that, and it will happen more and more. We've also got the research, Little Green Farmers doing the Quest program, which is very nice. Over east we're doing research, so a lot of research is happening, but it's driven by people who want to make money.
And Brian, the last question here as well.
I was just wondering, if somebody didn't have a lot of money and they needed this, how do they get on?
Well, if you were to apply and go for the Quest support, Little Green Pharma has the research. It's very good actually. They will give you a much discounted price. The cost for that is going to be you answering questionnaires every now and then to see what the outcome is. That's a good request.
And your website is Regaining Wellness? If people
Yes, I've got two websites actually, but Regaining Wellness, you can know more about me, regainingwellness.com. If you want that interview with Anita, who passed away in 2006, that's well worth looking at. And she wrote a book, by the way, called Dying to Be Me. But the story has been told actually. We met up and we went through that for the public. Lovely lady. Anita Moorjani, if anyone knows that name.
Sorry, what was the name?
Anita Moorjani.
How do you spell Moorjani?
Moorjani.
Great.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Brian Walker.